In the sort of counterculture and pacifist movements of the Vietnam War, living in a big city, how was witnessing that? What did that introduce any new ideas to you or anything?
Well, you're probably going to find this very, very hard to believe. But in the 1970s, I was an extraordinarily liberal guy. I was ACLU. Here that I went to work for was a card-carrying communist. He was the only lawyer practicing in the state of Maryland with a felony conviction. One of my jobs was that when these young men would surrender themselves to military authority, they would go to Fort Meade and turn themselves in. The MPs would tune them up. They'd beat them up. One of my jobs was when there was somebody who was going to turn themselves in, they'd come into this lawyer's office, a guy named Harold Buckman that I worked for. They'd strip down, and with a Polaroid camera, I would take 3 sets of shots of them in the nude to show that they were not marked. They did not have bruises. They did not have lacerations. They did not have bloody knots on their head. I'd take them to turn them in at Fort Meade, and I'd go to the provost marshal's office, and I would turn them in, and I would hand the provost marshal a set of these photographs, and I'd say, I have a set, and I am sending a set to your superior office, the commander of the Fort Meade base. If in fact these young men turn up with lumps, bruises, cuts, abrasions, we're coming after you because we have proof that they didn't have them when we turned them in. And then the other thing was at that point in time, there was it was famous in Baltimore. I don't know how famous it is any place else in the world anymore, but there was a thing called the Catonsville Nine. 2 Catholic priests, and I think at that time it was 7 lay. One was a nun. There was 2 nuns, 2 priests, and then a bunch of lay people who held positions in the Catholic Church. Went to a draft office, selective service office in Catonsville, Maryland. Stormed in, pulled out all the draft records, took them out into the middle of the parking lot, poured blood on them, and set them on fire. And they were arrested for destruction of federal property, and they were prosecuted both in state and federal court. The lawyer that I worked for represented them, and I got to see big chunks of their trial, which they were acting out of moral conviction. The 2 priests both did time. They were the Berrigans. One of the nuns went to jail, but it was a protest. It was one of the earliest protests of the Vietnam War by people who hadn't served, but who were acting out of conscience. So there was an anti-war movement in Baltimore, well-funded, well thought out, and it had legal representation. And I was fortunate enough to be part and parcel of that. Certainly not a trial lawyer, certainly not appearing in court. I wasn't a lawyer yet, but I got a chance to participate in their defense. And at the very end of our law school, first of all, Kent State happened when the kids were shot by the National Guardsmen. And then there was the bombing of territory in Laos, which was against all the rules we had set. So there were big protests down at the University of Maryland in College Park. There was a fear that, in fact, the National Guard or the military or the police would react the same way they reacted at Kent State, and there would be bloodshed. So I am not really certain who put it together, but a bunch of the people in the law school put together observers. We had armbands and all kinds of crap, and we went down, and our job was to watch and document the reaction of the authorities to the protesters in College Park. Now, these protesters were not nice and calm, chanting stuff. They were throwing bottles and carrying on, but our job was to make certain, A, to try to get them to calm down, but B, to try to film whatever or witness whatever happened as reaction to that. It was so disruptive to the law school that the law school were coming right into final exams. So what they said was, if you had participated in this effort to calm things down at the University of Maryland, you could waive taking your final exams and just accept your grade point average as it was. They didn't have to tell me twice that that was an option. I said, give me what I got. I don't want to take the exams.